Hello, my name is Wojciech Hardy, and today I'm going to talk about what happened when 4 episodes of a major TV show got leaked online before their official premiere. So file sharing is a very multi-dimensional problem, and that there is no one answer on how it actually affects sales. For one, the effects can vary across for different types of content. So the effects might be different for a digital song than there are for cinema tickets and than there are for physical books. Two is that the influence is actually changing over time. When you think of downloading a movie like 15 years ago, that would probably be quite troublesome. But today you can just stream it in real time and in high definition. So this also changed, and industries started to compete with file sharing in more convenient and cheaper ways like Netflix or Spotify or other services. And three, the effects actually might depend on the circumstances of the file sharing. If a movie gets leaked online before its premiere in cinemas, some studies shown that this might actually cause much harm to the ticket sales in the first days in the cinema, which is a bit different than in the cases where you actually have access to authorized sources, because if there is a pre-release leak, you actually have an additional incentive to turn to the unauthorized sources because you can't get the content from an authorized one. So I'm currently doing a research project which got funding from the National Science Center in Poland, and I want to answer 2 main questions. One is what happens when people try file sharing for the first time. The other one is what happens when they try authorized sources for the first time. This study is focusing on the first question. And the idea is that there are some people who focus on the authorized channels, but maybe something happens that makes them try out the unauthorized ones for the first time. And they do so, they learn how to do it, and what happens next? Do they revert to the authorized channels as they did before, or do they perhaps stay and continue using the unauthorized ones since they've already learned how to do it? So there was one study that touched upon it by Danaher et al. From 2010, and they looked at what happened when NBC removed all of its content from iTunes. Basically, for some reason, they decided they don't want to sell their content on iTunes anymore. And what happened was that file sharing traffic for this content increased dramatically in the following months because people no longer had access to an authorized digital alternative. But what is more interesting is that when the NBC content got back to iTunes, because after several months they decided maybe it wasn't such a good idea after all, the file sharing traffic did not decrease. That kind of means that people continued using the unauthorized sources and didn't want to go back to the authorized ones. And this is something I want to look at in the context of Game of Thrones, which is a major TV show, one of the most popular ones. It has a very large audience. 7 seasons were aired. In the study, I'm looking at the first 6. They all had 10 episodes. The episodes were aired weekly. And the thing that happened is that just before the 5th season started, 4 first episodes were leaked online. And this was much ahead of the schedule, okay? And when you look at the viewership of Game of Thrones, you can see that each season had actually a larger audience than the previous seasons, but this trend kind of stopped with the 5th season, which had more or less the same audience as the previous one, okay? So something happened around that time, which is, we don't know yet if it will. I'm going to try to prove that it was the effect of the leak. And if we try to model this viewership only with the information about the previous viewership and the viewer ratings of the episodes, then this is what we would get, the gray line. So it's not like the quality of the TV show got poorer. It doesn't explain why the season 5th didn't get a larger audience than the previous ones. So as a first step, we can look at check if it is indeed the case that people noticed the leak, okay? And we can do it by looking at Google search popularity for the phrase Game of Thrones. This is for seasons 4 and 6. And as you can see, there are some large spikes around episodes 1 and 10, okay? But other than that, there's not that much happening. This is for seasons that didn't have any episodes leaked. But when you looked at the season 5, which is this red line now, you can see that episodes 2, 3, and 4 weren't as searched around the time of their official airing. Okay? On the other hand, around the time that the first episode was aired, there was much traffic in Google, and it lasted for 2 days. So the day of the leak and the next day where the official premiere took place. So clearly the people who were online noticed the leak. So the thing is that with the viewership, that we don't really know if this is something that happened only to Game of Thrones or whether this was something that happened to maybe viewership of all TV shows around that time. So what I want to check is whether this was actually unique for Game of Thrones, and if so, I would expect that other TV shows didn't evidence a drop in the viewership, unless they shared parts of their audience with Game of Thrones, in which case they might have also been hit, let's call it, by this leak of Game of Thrones, okay? Because if people switched to file sharing and found it more convenient, they might have actually used it for other TV shows as well. And I want to check if the effects were persistent, if there were any, and I also corroborate this with by checking if search popularity for phrases like show name, watch online increased after the leak of Game of Thrones. So I collected some data about 70 TV shows that were aired around the time of the Game of Thrones leak. This constitutes more than 6,000 episodes, and I have information about their first day viewership on TV during their premieres, about the internet searches, so their popularity online, the show characteristics like the ratings for each episode, and other information like genres, runtime, etc. I also looked at some movie recommendation services that basically can tell you that if you like Game of Thrones, maybe you should try this TV series because other people who watch Game of Thrones also like these TV series. So this allowed me to identify in my sample 14 TV shows that shared their audience with Game of Thrones. And then I checked the viewership of the TV shows in time, okay, to check if it was actually Game of Thrones and the shows sharing their audience with Game of Thrones did experience some drops in viewership, or whether this was the case for all TV shows. And what I found is that actually there was a not very large, but a drop that was only specific for Game of Thrones, and a bit smaller drop, but still a significant drop for the TV shows that share their audience with Game of Thrones. So the green line is what would have happened if there was no leak of Game of Thrones, and the red one is what was the actual viewership. Okay, and to conclude, what I wanted to show is not really what the size of the effect was, because this is a very special case we're talking about right now. For other TV shows, if the incentives were different, maybe this effect would have a different size. But what I think is important, I can also corroborate these conclusions with data from Google searches, because for Game of Thrones, for shows that share their audience with Game of Thrones, the Google traffic slightly increased with the term search online, okay? And it doesn't seem like this viewership returned to its initial path. It shifted slightly downwards, decreased, and didn't get up later on. And this also shows that when something like this happens to a large TV show, it might have some spillover effects for other TV shows, and because these effects seem to be permanent or at least long-term, it seems that industries should put much effort on preventing even such one-time temporary incentives to switch to file sharing. Thank you very much.